Welcome back. In this video, we're going to look at the fossil record of the late Ediacaran and early Cambrian. So if you remember, at the end of the Avalon explosion, there were Cnidarians, and they had muscles. This is Heuschia, a fossil from 560 million years ago. And this is Anaria carli, which has an opening, and scientists think that it was an early Cnidarian also. So when we're talking about Cnidarians, we're talking about sea anemones and jellyfish. So this is a sea anemone, and so they have two types of tissue. They have an endoderm and an ectoderm, and then they have an internal cavity for processing food, and they have these tentacles to catch food as it's moving by. So this is what most scientists think the animal kingdom evolved from. These are called diploblastic, radially symmetric animals. And then the animals that evolved from 560 million years ago forward were triploblastic, meaning they had three germ layers, and they were bilaterian, meaning they were symmetric on both sides. So, or symmetric. So we're going to look at this sequence of evolution as defined by Mangiano, the rise and early evolution of animals. Where do we stand from a trace fossil perspective? So she's an expert in trace fossils, and there are not many actual fossils from this period, but there are a lot of trace fossils, such as burrows and paths and so on. And so she's able to reconstruct the type of animal that would have uh, laid down those trace fossils. So we'll begin with 560 million years ago. And so as you can see, there wasn't much going on. There's still these rangiomorphs and some very simple trails. But there was bilaterian or moving animal activity. There's a fossil from 558 million years ago. And so this entire phase from 560 to 540 million years ago has simple trails and unbranched burrows, which reflects the fact that the animals were fairly simple. They didn't have navigation systems such as sensors and so on. So this is the fossil from 558 million years ago, the White Sea Formation in Russia. And this is called Cambrian quadrata, and it's been interpreted in various ways, but it's generally interpreted now as ancestral to mollusks. Scientists think that it might have dragged a proboscis for possibly, stirring up the mud. It crawled along the seafloor and then ate the microbial mats, or the the microbes that were on the bottom of the sea. So during this period, animals slid across the seafloor. It was possibly a wave-like movement by constricting and relaxing the muscles, such as a worm. And they either absorbed nutrients from the seafloor, which I guess is maybe where the stomach foot came from in mollusks, or scratching and moving food into the body. Possibly this was a time when there was flatworms, the simplest of bilaterian animals. Let's move on to phase two, and what we're talking about here is Mangiano's phase two. So this is the early Cambrian, where there was quite an increase in complexity. So instead of just unbranched burrows, there were branching burrow structures, complex trails on the seafloor. And so this is the Cambrian boundary. Some people put it a few million years earlier, but it's characterized by what are called small shelly fauna. And the interesting thing about that is they're not necessarily small or shelly, and they might even just be parts of organisms. But the reason they look shelly is because they were preserved when they were covered with phosphate. At the boundary of the Cambrian, this preapulid worm is thought to have existed. And you might not think that it's a carnivore, but it actually waits down in its hole, and when a little organism passes by, it leaps up and eats it. It had a body cavity, but no coelom. Okay, so that was the transitional period into the Cambrian, and now we are moving to the Fortunian period, which is Mangiano's phase 3. And during this period, you can see that there's an explosion, she says, of undermat. So this is the microbial mat on the seafloor, undermat miners. There's novel burrows, new body plans. There's predation as holes are drilled into organisms. So we have some carnivores. And then also they moved into shallower and deeper water from where they were before. So they colonized new parts of the sea. There's evidence of navigation and sensory systems, such as light-sensitive spots or smell systems. There's scratch imprints that indicate some sort of arms or ability to dig. And there's possible indication of protostome annelid worms or possibly deuterostome acorn worms. And there are many what are called crown group bilaterians. For example, there was Halkieria, and this is a fossil of Halkieria. They have many fossils of this. It's a very odd looking organism. They call it slugs with chainmail. They had these shells that consisted of many little pieces. There are also possible traces of arthropods, and there were protoconodonts or Chetognatha. So this is the protoconodont, Chetognatha, and it still exists. It's an arrow worm. And as you can see, it's pretty fierce, although it's very small. Sometimes small animals are very fierce, as we know. And so they think it might have been a primitive protostome. And so it would consume planktonic animals. So it was a carnivore. Okay, let's move on to phase 4A. This would be Mangiano's phase 4A. This would be Cambrian stage 2 between 528 and 521 million years ago. There were many suspension feeders with lophophores, and there were possible trilobite ancestors during this period. So this is not a trilobite, but it might have been a trilobite ancestor. There are many of these burrows where animals extended their lophophores into the water column and fed on particles moving by. So these would be some of those. These are called phoronids. And so they have tubes, and then they extend their lophophore out of the tube into the water, and then they can retract them if they feel threatened. But these were little animals that lived in tubes. And I think it's interesting that the vertebrate ancestors, the cephalochordates or Amphioxus, you might have heard of them, they were also filter feeders. So the fact that filter feeders emerged during this time might indicate that the cephalochordates emerged during this time. This is a possible trilobite ancestor from 525 million years ago, Parvancorina. It had these ridges. I don't really understand it completely, but it has a similar shape of a trilobite. So they're really not sure if it was a trilobite ancestor, but it might have been. And then finally, we move on to Cambrian stage 3, which is the period you've probably seen movies of with all these crazy animals moving around. And so this is Mangiano's phase 4b, 521 to 514 million years ago. So this is when most of the phyla, animal phyla, or large groups of animals first appeared. And so many types of crazy animals, trilobites and burrowing animals, a lot of movement through the seafloor to eat detritus or decayed organic matter. There were reef-building organisms, the Archaeoceta, and so there's some like cup-shaped organisms and so on. They no longer exist, but existed at that time. And so basically, scientists like to call this a war. And this war led to quite a bit of evolution as animals competed to survive. So for example, this is Anomalocaris. It developed arms to catch prey, eyes to see prey, and it was able to swim. This is Achaea, which looks like a velvet worm, but it ate sponges. This is Opabinia, which had some sort of strange proboscis in which to capture animals. Then, of course, we have the most famous member of the this period, the trilobite. And these were like, I don't know, little bugs that crawled along the seafloor. They were very mobile. They had exoskeletons. And so I actually have a trilobite that I have from the Grand Canyon. I bought it. I didn't find it. But that's actually my pet. I have a pet trilobite. We'll see you next time.